There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Welcome to the best of 2020, where we're bringing you some of our favourite episodes of true crime conversations from the past year. Today's episode is my interview with investigative journalist Allan Clarke about the 1988 death of Mark Haines, as uncovered in the ABC podcast Unravel, Blood on the Tracks. The following episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of violence, murder and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples should also be aware that this episode may contain the names and voices of people who have passed away. The sun is rising on the morning of Saturday, January 16, 1988, and light rain drizzles over Tamworth, a city in north-east New South Wales. A freight train driver pulls out of Tamworth, heading to Sydney, and keeps his eyes up ahead. He sees something in the distance, a pile of clothes perhaps. But as he edges closer, he realises that lying on the train tracks about 7 kilometres outside of Tamworth is the body of a young man. By the time he pulls the brake, it's too late. The body disappears under the freight train. It's not long after that Glenn Bryant, a Tamworth station master, receives a phone call. There's been an accident. He arrives at the scene and is the first to discover the body of 17-year-old Mark Haines. But it's nothing like he expects. There's no blood, random objects are scattered around the tracks, and something is propping up the young man's head. The railway line in Tamworth separates the regional city in two. On one side is the white community, on the other is the Indigenous community. Mark was an Indigenous man who straddled both worlds, and whose death still haunts the town. For more than 30 years, his family has been asking questions, and now it seems we might have some answers. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Allan Clarke, a Muruwari man and an award-winning investigative journalist, producer and presenter. Allan hosted the Walkley award-winning first season of the ABC podcast, Unravel, Blood on the Tracks. For 5 years, Allan worked closely with family and friends reinvestigating the 1988 death of Aboriginal teenager Mark Haines in regional New South Wales. Allan's reporting probed deep enough for the case to be reopened and exposed the racial prejudices and inequalities peppered throughout the investigation into Mark's death. Let's begin on Saturday, January 16, when a man named Glenn Bryant is called by a train driver. Glenn is a station master in Tamworth, and the train driver tells him something pretty horrific that's happened. What had happened?
So Glenn Bryant was in his 30s at the time. He was the West Tamworth station master, and he got a call from a freight train driver leaving Tamworth who saw a body on the tracks, essentially. The train had gone over that body, and that train driver, did not want to get out and go back and check. He was obviously very traumatized, so he called Glenn, and Glenn got on his little push bike and rode out to the tracks, which are a few k's out of Tamworth. And the train driver just basically said, "I think there's a bloke in the middle of the tracks. I think he's dead. You should go, have a look." So Glenn goes and finds the body of 17-year-old Mark Haines, who is laying kind of between the sleepers, so not across the track. So he's pretty intact, you would say. I mean, there were no missing limbs or anything like that. But immediately, Glenn starts to see things that raise red flags. He starts to see bits and pieces of bizarre, what we'd call evidence now. But there was a comb, there was cigarette lighters scattered around. There were bits of Christmas wrapping paper that was scattered around. Just really strange things. And then the body itself. So Mark had quite deep cuts across his chest, and also on his arms and his legs. And they were almost bone deep. In some cases they were. Yet there was very little blood at the scene. In fact, there was, Glenn says he could only really see a spot of blood about the size of a 50-cent coin on a sleeper. So immediately Glenn, who obviously works in that industry, has seen a lot of train fatalities, and he knows that if a train passes over someone and cuts them and they're alive when that happens, that there is an enormous amount of blood that you would find. So immediately Glenn starts to get the feeling that Mark was probably placed on the tracks. So this is kind of the first time someone thinks that this is suspicious, that this isn't just that Mark has stumbled on the tracks or committed suicide. And then obviously the police show up and Glenn tells them this.
So what do the police make of that scene? What's their first instinct about what's happened?
The first instinct by the initial police were that it wasn't suspicious to them. They felt like Mark had either sort of stumbled onto the tracks and been hit accidentally, or that it was a possible suicide. So they were their kind of initial thoughts. And Glenn remembers the original officers sort of telling him this. He watched them as the police then kind of looked around the area, looked around the scene, and the police failed to take evidence from the tracks. They just did a very, very basic look around the scene. Later on that day, they did find it was a stolen Tirana, a car that had crashed kind of further down the tracks, and it was kind of in a ditch. So in their minds, the police started to think or come up with a theory that Mark had somehow possibly stolen this car, crashed it in the middle of the night, gotten out of that car, walked onto the tracks, and then lay down on the tracks, put a towel under his head, and then had a train pass over him. One of the things that is astounding in that initial look at the crime scene is that Mark had a towel that was described as being neatly folded under his head. The police lost that evidence. They could not find it later. One of the officers, when you read back through the transcripts, said that, we think that the towel might have gone to the morgue with Mark. We don't know. Somewhere it's been lost. So, it's pretty obvious from the get-go that they weren't treating this as a suspicious death. I mean, they already kind of had come to a basic theory, and decades later, it was hard to get them to actually even deviate from that initial investigation.
So that theory that he has essentially stolen a car and driven it, taken things from the car, walked a long way in what you discovered on the podcast was not a particularly easy walk. I believe his uncles even tried it and were unable to do it. There were a number of outlandish things that he would have had to do in order for that to be true. What were his uncles' response to that? What did they think about him potentially stealing a car and driving it? Why was that something that wasn't possible?
Well, immediately, the family absolutely knew that there's no way Mark could have stolen a car. Everyone who knew Mark, his family, his friends, knew that Mark couldn't drive. In fact, people had tried to teach him to drive on several occasions, and Mark just couldn't get it. In fact, he was so frustrated at trying to drive that he just gave up. So the idea that he would break into a car, steal it, drive it on his own outside of town, a few Ks away, and then crash it and walk up onto these precarious train tracks because there is a bridge with large gaps between the sleepers, all in pitch dark, away from the lights of Tamworth. is just so implausible. So the uncles immediately knew that something was wrong. They started to challenge the police on their theories. For them, though, the police didn't seem that interested in doing any further investigations. I mean, looking back, I would say it was, perfunctory at best, that initial police investigation. The family actually went out to the train tracks. They tried to recreate that scenario. So they walked from where that white Tirana was crashed. In fact, it was still sitting there, so it hadn't even been taken into evidence. They walked up onto the train track. So there's like a steep rise onto the train track full of that kind of rock. So, it's even harder to get onto. They got onto it, and this is in the middle of the day, and they've tried to walk across this railway bridge where Mark would have had to have walked. There are sleepers with very big gaps between them. I've walked it a number of times. The uncles walked it back when this happened, and they could only make it halfway. I walked it, and they've got a safety walkway now, but back then they didn't. And it was terrifying because there's a very steep drop under it. And I can't see how a teenager who's potentially concussed from a car crash would walk across that in the middle of the night and not fall through one of those gaps. So then you start to see Mark's uncles, Duck, Jack and Craig, start to actually do their own investigation. And then they're actually actively going to the police with what they're finding, and the police are accepting it. It's completely outrageous. They go to the side of Mark's body. They collect the evidence that's there. There's a black comb. There's a pink cigarette lighter. They collect various bits and pieces of potentially crucial evidence and take it to the police, who then take it into evidence and later on actually say that they found it themselves. So there's an incident where one of the police officers says at the coronial inquest into Mark's death that he found the pink cigarette lighter that was near Mark's body and took it into evidence. It's only when he's challenged by the family's legal team that he admits, actually the family brought it into the police station. So very early on, the family knew that this was not Mark. This was just not in his character. And so that is the start of this 3-decade-long journey to get some semblance of justice. And that's been led by by Mark's uncles.
It was the first time I was able to get someone to take an interest in something that me and my family believed was terribly amiss. We have said, look, this is right out of character for our boy.
This is Mark, obviously.
Yeah.
When was that taken?
Well, I dare say that would have been taken 87 at Sister Barb and Arnie's house on Worrell Road. He shared the bedroom with my 2 eldest sons. He slept on the top bunk, and it was like, well, one of my own children were taken away.
Can you tell us what type of young man Mark was? What did he enjoy doing? How was he described by people who loved him?
Mark was incredibly loved and liked. He was a very, very laid-back boy, and people remember him being a real sort of larrikin, but a bit of a thinker as well. He would sort of have these long periods of where he would just kind of sit on his own and think and be off with his own thoughts. So he's very deep in that respect. His nickname was Stoney, and that's because sometimes he looked stoned because he would be sort of like off in his own world, thinking about life, thinking about the world. It's not that he was doing drugs. It's just that people thought, this boy is deep. And so he was really well loved. It's important to sort of look at Tamworth as a town that has always been racially divided. Mark lived literally on the other side of the train tracks where the Aboriginal community are. On the other side is the predominantly white community. Back then, Mark sort of was popular in both worlds. He had a lot of white mates. In fact, his best mate, Jason Wan, has sort of been with the family from the start in trying to get justice for Mark. And he was also really popular in the Aboriginal community there. So he kind of was able to walk between those two worlds, and not everyone could at that time. I mean, the racism within that town in the 80s was really in your face. So, you know, he was a boy that had a really sort of bright and big future. He was very respectful of all of his elders. At school, the teachers really liked him. And I think sort of the tragedy or the sad thing is that people don't get to know or empathise with someone like Mark, and I'm talking like non-Indigenous Australians, because we're so used to in the media just seeing Aboriginal people as perpetrators of crimes and not victims of them. So it's sad that this boy's life was cut down in its prime, and it's unfair. And so I think part of that journey for justice is also trying to say to the rest of Australia that Mark was a boy who didn't deserve this. The colour of his skin shouldn't make a difference in that. His family miss him terribly. His parents both passed without ever knowing what happened to Mark. I mean, it just shattered them. It devastated them. They had to rely on Mark's uncles to kind of continue the fight. For them, it was just such a gut punch that they never really recovered, and they both passed away without ever knowing what happened to him.
I think that context in terms of the place that Tamworth was in the 1980s and those roots that you're describing of the really divided town goes some way in explaining that initial police investigation and why it was assumed that this was almost the fault of the person who had died at the very beginning, because there obviously was some strange behaviour by the police at the beginning. Could you take us back to the hours leading up to Mark's death? What was he doing on that? I believe it was a Friday night on January 15th.
Yeah, so the night that all of this happened, Mark had gone out with his cousin Leah Craigie and her boyfriend at the time. So early in the night, they went out to a club in town, and then at some point he leaves his cousin Leah and goes to meet up with his girlfriend. He then goes around town for a little while with his girlfriend, meets up with a few different people here and there, and ends up at a bar in Tamworth that was sort of well known at the time, and basically stays there for a little bit, then leaves with his girlfriend and two other people. They walk into the town centre, and then they sort of part ways. Mark walks his girlfriend Tanya home to West Tamworth. And she says that he then said goodbye to her on the corner of Wilbertree and Edward Street. And the reason I bring up the names of the streets is that later on it becomes really important because a lot of things were happening in that area at that time. So Tanya says they parted company. She goes into her house and then she never saw Mark again. So there's a gap of about 3 or 4 hours between Mark saying goodbye to Tanya and then Mark ending up on the railway tracks and being discovered. So what happened in that time obviously is something that I've been trying to figure out for the past 6 years, and the family's been trying to figure out since 1988. Later on, we found out that there were actually witnesses in that area, Wilbertree and Edward Street, who saw a car pull up and speak with someone that looked like Mark. We also found another witness who said she had heard a very loud argument. It sounded like an Aboriginal teenager's voice. It sounded like he was really upset and he was yelling, "Leave me alone." Shortly after that, she heard a car come up the street at speed, turn the corner where Mark would have said goodbye to Tanya. But none of those leads were fully explored. In fact, the witness who heard that argument and then heard that car, it was at exactly around the same time that Mark would have been saying goodbye to Tanya. She wasn't taken seriously in the beginning. She, in fact, felt like the police were treating it as a joke. And she's a white woman in Tamworth, and she felt it was important to come forward. They alluded to her that she was almost making it up. It's just police work 101 that wasn't even done in that crucial kind of first few weeks of Mark's death. He was out. There were people who were out with him that night who were never interviewed by police. There were witnesses who came forward. There was an Aboriginal witness who said she actually saw Mark walking up the street and being bailed into a car. She was told that she was making it up because Mark was Aboriginal and she just wanted it to be true, that basically she was trying to lead the police into believing that Mark was the victim of foul play. So she was discredited pretty heavily during the coronial inquest. So from the get-go, it was very obvious that no one really wanted to get a resolution on this in terms of the police.
Mark Haines' family has been campaigning for answers for 29 long years. The 17-year-old's body was found on railway tracks near Tamworth in 1988. The police investigation and 2 coronial inquests put his death down to misadventure. His uncle refutes that. He believes Mark was murdered and his body dumped.
The ambulance officers did not notice any other blood. The boy's body only had 1 point of blood left in his body. So where is the other 7 to 8 points of blood?
Don Craigie has been critical of the level of police resources allocated to the case. There have been calls for the State Homicide Squad to take over the investigation on the anniversary of his death, a minor breakthrough.
There has been some consultation with State Crime Command since that correspondence, and I understand that the State Crime Command are willing to conduct a review of the investigation.
Greens MLC David Shoebridge has been campaigning on the family's behalf.
Well, we had 2 inquests with open findings. In fact, that demands further resources from the New South Wales Police because the police haven't been able to find an answer to date.
He wants the government to consider a cash reward for anyone with new information.
I would hope that both the Oxley Local Area Command and the Homicide Squad look at whether or not a decent cash reward is the kind of encouragement that's needed to bring someone forward.
So far, there has been no official reply from the Police Commissioner as to whether the State Crime Command will look into the case. Chris Wall, Prime 7 News.
I'm trying to imagine a case in which a white witness comes forward and sees a white person in the final moments of their life and they say, you're just trying to make something up. That's not a scenario that is even moderately imaginable. It just seems to be that there was such distrust and, as you say, racism towards the Indigenous community, which there are so many leads early on that aren't picked up, and within a few months rumours start swirling, and I believe it was about 6 months after 2 teenagers actually went to the police with a name. Who was Eddie Davis?
Eddie Davis was a local Aboriginal man in Tamworth. He was well known amongst the community there. He was also a really great boxer, amateur boxer, who people thought would go pro, and he had a really tough guy reputation. So those 2 teenagers who went there, basically, they were 2 friends of Mark. They'd been at a party and they'd heard from a girl that Eddie was involved in Mark's death somehow. And so the police did look into it, but, and I have to be clear about this, that I'm not suggesting Eddie was involved in the death. Early on in my reporting, Eddie was, in my mind, one of the persons of interest in that initial investigation, but I don't believe he was involved in it. But at the time, and this goes to, I guess, the police incompetence around the case, Eddie's name gets raised. People are talking about potentially that Eddie is involved with Mark's death. And so what do the police do? They put Eddie in an interview room and they invite Mark's uncles to come and sit down with Eddie. And it is just outrageous that, even though we know now that Eddie had nothing to do with it, at the time when you were canvassing for potential suspects, that you would allow that to happen. Basically, the police were telling the family at the time, before they had fully investigated suspects and vetted them and looked into their alibis, etc., they went to the family and said, you need to stop harassing Eddie, because at this point the family had found out that sort of Eddie was being attached to the case. And then to try and mediate any tension between the family and Eddie, the police think it's perfectly okay to put them in the same room. Obviously, they almost killed each other. They were about to swing punches. Like, it got very heated. And the fact that this was facilitated by the police in the first place is just astounding.
It's quite infantilizing to put 3 men or however many men in a room together and basically say, sort out your differences, as though this is a meaningless tension and someone's life isn't at the center of it. It's unthinkable. And with Eddie, there was never any actual evidence, was there, that he was linked to the crime? It was more just the words of those 2 teenagers?
Well, yeah, you're right. So there is no concrete evidence that Eddie was ever involved with Mark's death. And in reporting this case, I mean, as any investigative reporter that works sort of with crime will tell you, like, nothing is ever straightforward. So in those early days, the family are hurting, they are grieving, they're upset that the police are not doing their job. And so when the police get the tip that Eddie could potentially be involved, the family, who are not being supported by the police at all and allowed to do their own investigation, obviously then start to focus on Eddie, and particularly Uncle Duck, who's leading this kind of family investigation, starts to then look at Eddie, and he starts to get really upset that this man might be involved. The fact is, the police allowed that to happen because of the lack of communication between the family and the police about what was happening, whether they were investigating, what they were doing. It basically allowed for a situation where an upset, grieving family were able to then look at someone who didn't have anything to do with the death and focus on him at that point. And so they did have some dust-ups. In the podcast, you hear Eddie talk about, at the time, being roughed up by Mark's uncles, being pulled into a car by them and being roughed up, saying, what did you do? Like, what happened? And Eddie, even though obviously he's upset by it, says in the podcast he completely understands, because this is how Aboriginal people are treated by the police. They're desperate for answers. When there is one small kind of breakthrough in a case, you could say, they're going to jump on it. But basically the police had created a situation where there was a lot of tension within the Aboriginal community at that time. So people were turning on each other, and they were allowing that to happen.
When you started reporting on Mark's death decades later, new leads started to emerge because people were hearing about this story in the media. One of those leads was thanks to a woman named Faye, whose son Terry had been a friend of Mark's. What did she tell you?
Yeah, so after a few years of reporting, I got a message from Faye Suter, and she's lived in Tamworth her entire life. She told me that her son, Terry Suter, was a mate of Mark's, and that she believes that Terry was driving the car that night that was carrying Mark's body. Now, Terry killed himself on July 11th, 1988. So Mark had died in January. So about 7 months later, Terry took his own life. For Faye, she'd heard from her youngest son that on the night of Mark's death, he was woken in his bed by Terry, and then his older brother Terry takes him, into a car, and they go out to the train tracks. Terry tells his younger brother, Mick, to sort of stay back while he goes and does something. And remember, this is at night. So Mick stands back, but he's curious, and he kind of goes to have a look at what's happening, and he sees his brother Terry over the train tracks, tending to what looks like a sort of person on the tracks. And Mick, obviously being the younger brother, didn't know what was happening. Years later, he would positively say that Terry was out there doing something with Mark's body, and he thought he was actually trying to comfort Mark by putting a towel under Mark's head. We'll never get to ask Terry because he did take his own life in July, and it was all very sudden. His indoor cricket team had won the final that night, and they were all at the pub celebrating. He said to his mum, "I'm going to go home. I'll see you at home later." And when she got home, basically he'd left a suicide note that said, "I love you all, but can't handle life. Love, Terry." And so Faye heard from her youngest son about that night, and then for years it's kind of eaten away at her. And then she finally wanted to talk after I'd done some reporting on the case. So that's how I started to look down that road of whether or not Terry was involved in Mark's death. I don't think Terry was directly contributed to Mark's death, but I think that he was with people who made him drive the car that night.
And Mark's best friend was a guy named Jason One, who you mentioned before. And you'd been investigating this case for a lot of years when he decided to disclose something to you. What did he tell you about a guy named Greg Jones? And that's not his real name. That's how you refer to him in your reporting and in the podcast.
Yeah, so Jason was Mark's best friend. And then I'd been speaking with him for a few years, on and off. We were doing an interview with him for Australian Story, actually, when he came out with something that just it was like a bombshell. And he had been sitting on whether or not he should tell me. But basically it was in regards to someone called Greg Jones. That's not his real name. We can't use his real name for legal reasons, but Greg was a mate of Mark's and Jason's. They wouldn't say best mates. They'd say he was always kind of on the periphery of their friendship. So Greg's ex had come to Jason one night and was disturbed by something Greg had told her. Basically, Greg had gotten drunk and then confessed to her that he was actually out there on the night that Mark had died, and that he was the one who physically put Mark's body on the railway tracks. And I think at that moment when he said that, it's just unbelievable. That's when we started to look at Greg and talk to the police about potentially Greg's involvement. There was also another sort of part of that, which is that Greg had given details to his ex-partner that no one else really could have known at the time. So he had mentioned that there was a white box that had been placed on Mark's body. And if you go back now through the evidence, you'll see that the freight train driver initially had seen a white box on the tracks that morning. And, there were just too many things that, unless you're out there, you couldn't have known. So that was a huge revelation and bombshell in the investigation.
Did Jason have any insight into what the motive might have been, or how this had happened?
There's several theories about potentially what happened. Even I, at this point, am still not sure about the motive. Jason thinks, and I'm think along these lines as well now, looking back at everything. I don't think it was premeditated. I don't think someone set out on that night to murder Mark. I do think there was an accident at some point and Mark has died. And in a panic, these group of people have taken his body and put it on the train tracks to try and make it look like it was some kind of accident, or that Mark had walked out there alone. But the fact is that Mark was probably alive when he was placed on the tracks. So in a way, by them trying to cover this up, they in fact actually killed him, because if he was taken to the hospital, there is a chance that he could have been saved, because the cause of death ultimately was a subdural hemorrhage, which is basically bleeding on your brain. Now, you can be saved from that if you are taken to the hospital early enough. But as time goes on, it becomes a death sentence, really. So when Mark was on that track, he potentially had this subdural hemorrhage that killed him before the train ran him over. So as the train's run him over, he's dead already. That's why there's no blood at the scene.
And how likely is it in the train theory, which is what the police initially had, that kind of injury, the subdural hemorrhage, is there any chance that that could have been caused by being hit by a train, or is there pretty compelling forensic evidence that that would have been sustained before the train?
There is compelling evidence that this injury was sustained before the train. I spoke with Sydney forensic pathologist Professor Johan de Flue. He is one of Australia's most respected forensic pathologists. I got him to look back over Mark's autopsy reports. I got him to sort of pore over the coronial inquest transcripts. And he told me flat out that it would be extremely unlikely for that subdural hemorrhage to have been caused by a train running him over. It's also pretty unlikely that Mark dying in a car crash would have caused that subdural hemorrhage as well. So going by that evidence and in consultation with Dr. de Flue, he did say that it's more likely that Mark was struck on the head at some point, had basically a subdural hemorrhage or hematoma is when your head suffers from a very sudden blow. So you see it a lot in one-punch victims, people who fall and hit their head on the concrete. Basically, then the blood starts to build up, on your brain and put pressure on your brain. So I'm absolutely sure that Mark sustained that injury before getting to the train tracks.
Now, we know that he bled a lot because his organs were pale. You would absolutely expect there to be a lot of blood at the scene if all the injuries happen at the train track. And even if there's been rain, it will still be there. And it simply wasn't there. The obvious answer in this is that the bleeding occurred elsewhere.
The police also have a theory that after the car rolled, Mark was able to walk 1.5 kilometres away from where he eventually laid down and put himself on the tracks.
It's one of those injuries where there's infrequently a regaining of consciousness. In terms of walking 1.5 kilometres with a head injury like that, I really don't think that's the case. A much more obvious scenario is that he didn't walk, in which case he must have arrived there in some other way, potentially been taken there.
You eventually did speak with Greg Jones. What did he say to you when you put to him the theories that had been circulating and the testimony essentially from his ex-girlfriend?
Look, Greg was very calm throughout the interview, although he was also very cold in a way. And I mean, that's no indication of whether he is guilty or not. But I found it odd that he was meant to be one of Mark's mates, but found it hard-pressed to share any, funny anecdotes or just personal things that you would share about your best mates. When I did put the questions to him, he unequivocally denies ever having any involvement in Mark's death. He says at the time, he wasn't even in the area. He flat out says that this is all rumours and gossip made up by the community. And he says it's really disappointing to hear that. And basically that's it. So Greg, after that, the police did go and speak with Greg. But at that time, between my interview and the time the police went to speak with Greg, he had gotten a barrister and he declined to be interviewed by the police. I'm not sure where that's at now, whether or not they've interviewed him after that or had a conversation with him. But essentially, that's the last time I spoke with him.
And after the amount of research and investigating you've done into this crime and the people you've interviewed, what is the most predominant theory that you have at this point about what you think most likely happened in 1988?
I think that on that night, Mark was out and on the corner of Wilbertree and Edward Street, he was maybe picked up by a few people he thought were his mates. I think one of them has stolen the Tarana, potentially Terry Suter, and they've all gone joyriding. I think at some point there is an argument or a fight, and I think Mark is either punched in the head or he's pushed out of the car and hits his head, leading to that subdural hematoma. I think then there is panic, and so they drive out to Worrell Road where the Tarana was found and where Mark's body was found. I think then they try to make it look like Mark had stolen that Tarana, crashed it himself, walked on the train tracks and laid down. I do think Terry later that night went back out with his younger brother Mick, because I feel that Terry felt bad about everything that had happened, and maybe he'd gone back out to check once everyone was gone whether or not Mark was still alive. And I think when he realised that Mark wasn't alive, he had put a towel under Mark's head. Now, there's two theories as to why he did that. Mick, Terry's younger brother, thinks it was a sign of comfort, trying to kind of make Mark as comfortable as he could. The other one is that maybe he put that towel under Mark's head as a red flag to police that something wrong had happened that night. So that's essentially, I guess, the main theory at this point.
This obviously happened 1988, so many years ago, and there are a number of things we can look back at and ask why, the vehicle wasn't fingerprinted and why evidence wasn't collected properly at the scene, and it was never taken as seriously as it might have been if this was a white 17-year-old boy lying on the train tracks. I'm interested if you think that if this crime happened today, how different things would be, or if there is still some element of the police force which deals with Indigenous Australians differently in these sorts of cases. Like, do you think we've come far from 1988, or do you think that there are still things that remain the same?
I don't think much has changed at all, to be honest. I've spent the better part of my career over the past 12 years or so looking into unsolved Aboriginal murders between 1988 and Mark's case all the way up to the late 2000s. And in all of them, I mean, it's staggering the lack of interest from police in those cases. It's astounding the amount of times they've bungled initial investigations and made it much harder for the families to get justice later on. I think we have a really long way to go in this country because we do have a narrative, and it's very rooted in our history, that Aboriginal people are more likely to be offenders than victims. All of the negative media that we've seen over the years just constantly show Aboriginal people as perpetrators of violence, not the victims of it. And so I think it's ingrained in us. And while the police have changed in their attitudes over the years, there is still such a long way to go. I'm about to begin directing a documentary on the Barraville murders, where 3 Aboriginal children were murdered within the space of 5 months in the early 90s in a small town of Barraville. And it is astounding the in-your-face racism that the families encountered in the beginning, just to try and get the police to believe that their children were victims of homicide. They were told initially that the children had gone walkabout. This is just one of many, many examples across the country of sloppy police work when it comes to Aboriginal murders. I do think as a country we have a very long way to go, and that starts with education, from a very young age, about Australia's true history and how we are built on this very, very big racial divide. And we can't really close that until we start truth-telling and being honest about this, because at the end of the day, the Aboriginal community are suffering and we experience so much trauma. So imagine what it must be like to lose your son or your daughter and then have to spend 30 years trying to convince a system that failed you in the beginning that your child's life mattered, that it deserves media coverage, that it deserves proper police resourcing. It's something that people should never have to do, and yet Aboriginal victims' families have to do this on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think sharing stories like these really matter, and like Bowraville, they're stories that never leave you. Thank you so much for your time, Allan. We really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you so much.
The family's out here because they've been carrying the burden for far too long by themselves. No family should have to put up their own money as a reward to solve the murder of their son or of their nephew. And it's about time the state government actually stood up and put the state's money at risk, not the family's money.
It's been a long time. It's a trying time. And virtually hardly a day would go by that, someone would not mention Mark's name. And it's very emotional every time I mention it. Approximately 7 years ago, Greg Smith, the Attorney General back then, promised to post a reward. Now, that did not eventuate. He reneged on that. So, in other words, they didn't give a stuff about our boy. They didn't worry about him for 29 and a half years. And what we are here today for is to say to the state government and the Tamworth Local Command and New South Wales Police, the Attorney General, that, this isn't right. It's abominable that families have to go out of their own way to investigate what they believe is very serious crimes. The forensic pathologist has said that the boy was more than likely dead before he was placed on railway tracks. Lose faith, because the truth will come out and they would be embarrassed by the truth. Thank you.
Allan Clarke's reporting on the murder of Mark Haines can be found across various publications, all of which you can find in the description of this episode. You'll also find links to listen to the podcast Unravel, Blood on the Tracks. For updates on this case, photos, maps, and further information, you can join our closed Facebook group. Search True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper. Thanks for listening to the best of True Crime Conversations 2020 with me, Jessie Stevens. Join me next week to hear my interview with Rafi Berg, the Middle East editor for BBC News Online, where we discuss the curious case of a fake diving resort on the Red Sea, as explored in his book, Red Sea Spies, The True Story of Mossad's Fake Diving Resort.